this. Can everybody approve the being recorded?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you all for being very flexible at the time. I'm sorry that I sort of bungled the scheduling, but glad you all could make it today and glad we can get this done so then we can stay on track and learn some more stuff on Thursday. So that's all great stuff. I'm gonna have like a bunch of slides I'm gonna go through them. Oh, geez. This might be tricky. I can go through my speaker if you want to chime in too. Okay. So yeah, I have slides, but like since this is a smaller group, I definitely want people to just pause me to ask questions. So don't feel like you need to, like, I'm not like, I'll like ask about questions for each slide, but like just interrupt me or be like, this doesn't make sense, or like ask for an explanation. And I can also like be a little more flexible and like, you know, just pop over to a different tab to pull up an example or something. So yeah, today we're going to be talking about tires. I'm not going to cover like everything about tires, but I'm going to try and just help paint a picture of like what's actually going on within the tire when we're racing. And so for next, I might mix more like supplemental stuff to read about between now and the next presentation that'll sort of help cover some more stuff. But for now, let's just get started. So a little bit of an overview we're going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about slip angle and what that means. I'm going to talk about lateral force and longitudinal force that the tires generate, and I'm going to talk about tire forces versus the normal force on the tires. So those are kind of like the three big sections we're going to talk about today. So I'll start with slip angle. So if you guys read RCVD, you might recognize this sort of graphic. My goal when I'm talking about slip angle for the next few slides is that I think RCVD doesn't quite paint a clear enough picture for what's actually happening. And so I just want this to be like a little more visual, a little bit more like, I want everybody to walk away with this feeling like they have a bit of an intuitive understanding for what's actually happening when the tires are generating slip angles and what exactly that means. So the way that they present it is they present this model tire. And does a model tire make sense to everybody? Like, can you unmute yourself and be like, yeah, this sort of like makes sense?
Yep.
Pretty much.
Bro, hell yeah. Diana, I don't know if you got to this section, but basically like it's a piece of rubber, and that's what's, let me turn my pointer on. So that's what this little middle section is. That's a piece of rubber. And then there are these clamped metal plates on the sides. So these metal plates are squeezing a piece of rubber and they're rolling that disc of rubber. Now what they do, and here's what I think is kind of confusing, but it also kind of makes sense, is what they do is they apply a lateral force to this model tire as it's rolling. So they have it on this track, like it's on like a treadmill basically. They have this model tire rolling on a treadmill, and then they apply some lateral force to it. And you can imagine like if you've got this like kind of squishy rubber disc and it's got some weight on it and you push it to the side, you can definitely kind of imagine that like this bottom section would start to deform sideways. Does that make sense? Does that kind of feel intuitive for everybody?
Yeah.
Honestly, just like stay unmuted the whole time unless you have like something going on in the background. It'll just be nice to kind of get some verbal confirmation as we go along. So then they go on to sort of explain, okay, so now on this right graphic here, this is like a bottom view of the tire, right? And so what we've got here, what my pointer is on right now, this is what that deformation looks like. This is what, like, as you're pushing the tire to the side and we're looking at this from the bottom, this is kind of what that little deformed patch looks like. And what's unclear still here is that they are still applying this lateral force. That is what's causing that little deformation. And then they talk about like what way the wheel is going to travel. I think it's a little bit confusing, so I've created my own graphic that hopefully helps. The other thing to note about this is that they sort of throw this in there, but I don't think it's made explicitly clear that like the model tire is supposed to represent sort of like the center line of an actual tire. So on this slide, I've kind of thrown together a little graphic of what this might look like on a real tire. So in this context, we're looking, imagine that we're driving the tire on a glass plate and we're standing below it looking up. So you can see this is us. In the corner here, we're looking underneath the tire and the tire is rolling and then we are applying some lateral force onto the tire. So again, this is a bottom view of the tire, and we can see that the treads of the tire are coming in, and because of the lateral force, they're deforming and then sort of returning back to normal. And this tire is rolling, okay? And so the tire heading, which is the direction the tire is facing, is sort of like forwards, if you will. But because of the deformations that are occurring in the tire, that is going to cause the tire to take a path that is along the line of those deformations. And that's exactly what this is showing here on this previous slide. That's what this line, this axis is showing, how that's parallel with the deformation here. It's the same thing, but that's what's happening sort of like in the whole tire, you can imagine. And then again, what we have here is the angle between the direction the tire is facing and the direction the tire is actually traveling along is called your slip angle. That makes sense?
One
that's
thing
where they...
go for it. The tire doing this made sense to me when I was first learning it, but what really helped me was thinking about the tire. If you're applying force, like the car applies forces to the tires, but it worked better for me to think of not that the tire was feeling the car forces, but that the tire feels the reaction force from the road. So like it's a little confusing that the tire like bends the opposite way of the force. But the reason is you push the tire to the left, the road is pushing back to the right. And that's the important piece, because that means like that when you turn, like your tires feel a force. Like if you turn to the right, your tires are going to, like you're putting a force into the tires to the left. The important piece is that the tires feel a reaction to the right.
Yeah,
that's definitely. Does it also have something to do with the fact that like the tire is sticking to the road? So like that bottom part sticks in its original place while the rest of it moves?
That's exactly what's happening. The tire sticks, but like you're moving the body of the tire to the left.
Yeah.
But the tread is sticking. So what happens is like, and this is only because it's rolling. Because it's rolling, when you put down the next piece is shifted to the left from the last piece, but they're stuck to the road so they can't move. So that's why you go at an angle.
Exactly.
Cool. And it retains the same heading though, right? The tire?
Yeah, the tire heading will be like whatever you're dictating with the steering wheel.
Okay.
But the direction that it's traveling along is related to how much deformation is in the tire. And that deformation is denoted as a slip angle.
Okay.
That's like an important thing to think about. Like that tire deformation is like the same thing as slip angle.
Cool.
So then that's sort of like where we get to this graphic, right? Like the path that the tire is traveling along is that axis that it's deforming at. Cool. So then here's a really, really, really important piece. And this is one that RCVD does not. It's like they casually throw it in the bottom, in a sentence, in a random paragraph in the bottom of the page. But this is like essential, is that if you have a tire and you apply a lateral force, you will generate a slip angle. But the inverse effect is true. If you have your tire and you generate a slip angle via a different method, your tire will then apply a lateral force. So it works both ways. And that's what's confusing, is they give the example in the lateral force to slip angle case, but when you're driving your car, you're generating slip angles and getting lateral force out of it. Or at least that's an easier way for me to think about it. I think it's a little more intuitive.
How do you generate slip angles without?
That's coming.
Okay.
We're getting there. Okay. So we're going to talk about slip angle generation now. So say we're driving along a road. Okay, we have our little race car here, and we're driving forwards. Okay, so vehicle direction, forwards. Now we're going to turn our wheels. Boom. Sweet animation, Nate. And now our tires are facing to the right. Okay. Our vehicle has momentum, right? And so when you turn your wheels, now what's happening is your tires are not pointed the same way that your vehicle is pushing them. So because of the momentum of your vehicle pushing against the direction that your tires now have to roll, that is generating a slip angle. So that is what's like deforming the rubber in your tires. And that deformation caused by your vehicle heading being different than your tire heading is what's stretching that rubber and creating that slip angle, which is then creating that lateral force.
Is that where it is?
Yeah. Slip angle is, my understanding, slip angle is the difference between the direction the wheel is moving and the direction the wheel is facing.
Exactly.
And
So
so,
the slip angle in this case, and actually let me go to the next slide,
yeah.
because this is going to capture exactly what you're just asking. So our vehicle heading is still this gray arrow. Our tire heading is still this red arrow, but the path the wheels are taking are this green arrow. So the slip angle, let me do a little annotation here. This slip angle is not this. This is not our slip angle. This is our slip angle. Does that help? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so I tried to find a nice video of like when you're driving your car, the path that your car takes is not the direction your wheels are facing, which I think is like an important like mental image to have in your head, is that when you turn your tires, your car is now not just following the path set by your tires at high speed corners. And now this is another really important thing, and I'll say this, but don't attach too much weight to it. When you're going at low speeds, so like you're driving like 5 miles an hour, you actually don't generate slip angles. You don't generate like substantial slip angles, and your car does follow the path set by the direction of your wheels. So at low speed corners, like you turn your wheels, your car will roll at a radius determined by that angle. But at high speed corners, when we generate slip angles, that no longer becomes true. Our vehicle is traveling at some angle between where the direction it's facing and the direction that our tires are facing. But it's not one or the other. It's somewhere in between that based on how much slip angle is being generated.
And so at essentially no speed or low speed, your direction of movement is at your tire heading. And at like infinite speed, your direction of heading, your direction of motion is going to be in your vehicle heading. And that's because you're going to generate essentially not infinite slip angle, but or like not like it's just going to be sliding. Like that's just understeer.
Yep.
And is that proportional to the amount of momentum, like the velocity of your vehicle and mass, like momentum? Or are we going to get to how to calculate? Because
I honestly, calculating the amount of slip angle that gets generated is extremely difficult.
Okay.
We tried to come up with some models of it a couple of summers ago, and like you can get some estimates, but it is extremely difficult to determine.
Yeah.
It's based on a lot of factors, which is why it's sort of like, to me, this is like an important point of racing, that like you always have to be thinking about the driver. Like what the driver is doing is feeling how much lateral force is getting generated, and like they have some understanding of kind of what that is going to feel like, but it's very difficult to model exactly like how much slip angle is required to take a turn. But you can kind of back calculate it, but it's hard, and I don't have a good enough answer. I'm sure there are people who have models of this and do like cool stuff with it, but I don't have an answer for how to calculate how much slip angle you're generating based on your speed and your steering angle.
Okay.
But that being said,
it's also tire dependent.
It's very tire dependent. But that being said, it is a function of speed and steering angle, which I think I have on the slide coming up here. Okay. Oh, let me clear my annotations. Okay. Cool. So does this general concept make sense to everybody?
Yep.
Awesome. Okay. So why do we even care about lateral force? So we determined that like we're going some speed, we're turning our wheels, our tires are generating some slip angle, and that slip angle is generating some lateral force. Why do we care? Okay. This is an oversimplification, but it is very important for understanding. When you are taking a turn, you are taking your car and you are moving it in some radius. Whereas if you were to hold that speed and that steering angle, you would go in a circle of some radius, okay? And the radius of that circle is simply the centripetal acceleration equation. So we have some mass, the mass of our vehicle, we're traveling at some velocity, and then we would be going at some radius. And this radius and velocity are directly determined by this centripetal force. And this centripetal force, this inward force, is the same thing as our lateral force from our tires. So you can think about the lateral force from our tires is causing our car to travel in a circle the same way that when you spin a ball on a string, it goes in a circle. You have some forward velocity and some sideways force, and those two things are going to cause your body to move in a circle. Does that make sense?
Yep.
It's pretty fundamental. Like it's like stuff we learn like in high school physics, but like it's again a really important model to have in your head of just how these things work. Now, again, these get much more complicated when you start to look a little bit more under the hood. For instance, you can imagine forces being generated at your front and rear tires, causing a different yaw moment about your vehicle. But we'll get into that in some future sessions. Right now, just have a model in your head of lateral force, forward velocity, caused us to move at some radius.
Can I clarify centripetal and acceleration?
Yes.
Both mine and others' understandings.
Go for it.
So like, when I first learned centripetal acceleration in high school, like it's like, oh, like this is an acceleration, like this is a force that's present, and then the teacher goes, oh, this is actually like an imaginary force, doesn't really exist, and then moves on. And that's like confused me ever since. So my understanding is like this force like is not like there's no, in this instance, there's no like string pulling on the center of the car. What's actually happening is your car is moving in a straight line. And when you turn your wheels, you generate a force at the front and at the rear. Like you have forces generated at the front and rear tires that are pointing to the right. And when your force is all to the right, your velocity doesn't change at all because there's no acceleration in the longitudinal direction. So you're going to continue moving at a continuous velocity.
Mm-hmm.
But the acceleration generated from the tires is going to move your car. It's going to shift your car to the right. But what happens is because that acceleration is fixed in the like reference frame of your car, the acceleration is moving, like the direction of force moves with your car. So you move in a circle that's constant.
Yeah.
If you had a car and you just pulled, to the right, but it wasn't fixed to the car, your car would turn to the right, but it would just turn and keep going in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
So my understanding is this equation is not an actual, like this is not there's no like God-given force that like pulls on this car. This is a description this is like a model of rotational motion based on forces from the tires, assuming like everything's even and whatnot.
Yeah, that's true. I think the imaginary force that you're talking about is the opposite force, which is centrifugal force, which is an inertial force that you feel.
Sure.
And so the description that you gave of force that's changing based on the reference frame of the vehicle is captured. I believe this equation is designed to sort of capture that in a much more general sense.
Yes.
Like the equivalent of like tires pushing to the right versus a string pulling to the right is the same. But your way of describing it is like, I think, much more thorough and like accurate. So that's for sure. But the force from the tires is like not imaginary, obviously, and like it is directly what causes you to move in a circle.
So this is something that confuses me like every damn time I get to a dynamics problem.
Oh, it's insane. Yeah, it's extremely oversimplified, like this equation, and like does not capture the intuition well. But
the bit that always catches me up is we talk about this force as kind of a global force for the car, but then there's also tire forces, and it's important to remember that this is just a nice, neat description of kind of other forces that are happening. Like, don't double count your forces is kind of what I'm saying.
Oh, okay, yeah, absolutely. I should have made that clear on the graphic. Like, each tire is generating some force to the right, and we're going to sum those up about the center of mass of the vehicle and like assume that like the global frame. But again, what we're going to get into in some future sessions is, say you have different front and rear tires that are generating different amounts of force. Now you have an imbalance of forces within your vehicle. And that imbalance of forces is going to cause your vehicle to rotate that's on a rotation that's different from the centripetal rotation, which is where we get into things like oversteer, understeer, and vehicle balance, which is like a really important thing. So conveniently for us, all four of our tires are the same, which really helps with neutral steer. But you'll see like in F1 cars, they have very differently sized front and rear tires. but that could also be to account for the fact that I don't know where their center of mass is, but it might be a bit rearwards. I'm not sure, but like we'll get into sort of more what that looks like from a vehicle handling perspective, probably this Thursday. But for now, just think about turns being created by lateral force of the tires, and that's basically just a centripetal acceleration problem. Awesome. Okay, so I'm gonna give a quick recap of what we just covered so that everybody's sort of like on the same page and we can make sure we're all on the same page. So the difference between the tire's heading and the vehicle heading creates some deformation in the tire. The angle between the tire heading and the path that the tire takes is called the slip angle. Deformations in the tire cause slip angles, which create lateral force. And so if we want to create lateral force, ultimately what we're going to do is we're going to steer the wheel, which is going to change the heading of the tire relative to the heading of the vehicle. The momentum from the vehicle is going to create some deformation in the tires. That deformation is going to cause lateral force. Lateral force from all four tires is going to cause us to travel around some radius. So that's like the flow chart of how we go from turning the wheels to actually turning the vehicle in a corner. Does that sound good, everybody? Kyle and Neil, yeah, anything to add to clarify that?
No, that makes a lot of sense.
Alex slide bombed me. But I told him I'd leave it in.
Oh my lord.
Okay, so yeah, like I said before, slip angles are generated from the two following effects: velocity and steering angle. Okay. Oh, okay. So now let's back up a little bit. And remember that we want to be accelerating. This came from the presentation that I gave a week and a half ago. We want to be accelerating as much as possible in the most correct direction at all times, right? And that's basically to say that when we're racing, we're taking turns of all sorts of different radii at all sorts of different speeds. So again, kind of going back to this equation, what happens when we want to change the velocity or the radius of turn? And the answer is we need more lateral force, or we need different amounts of lateral force. So say like if we wanted to make this turn faster, we would need to have higher lateral force, right? Or, I mean, that's basically it. Like if we want to make a tighter turn or have faster speed, we need more lateral force. So that might bring up another question in your mind, which is, well, how do we get more lateral force? And as we sort of determined, we need higher tire deformation. That is, we need a higher slip angle, because the higher the deformation is, the more lateral force we're going to get. And so that is captured in this graph. And this is a very key graph for tires, which is a lateral force versus slip angle plot. So there's a lot. It kind of looks, I mean, on the one hand, it's kind of straightforward. Like, as you imagine, the more slip angle you have, the higher your lateral force becomes. But let's break this graph down a little bit and sort of understand the different regions, which nicely RCVD does break out for us here. So for the first section, we call this the linear region, or the elastic region, because this is where the amount of lateral force that you get is directly proportional to the amount of slip angle that you have. And that's it's a linear relationship. So like the more you turn the wheels, the more linear force you're going to get. So this is like pretty chill. Like it's pretty easy for a driver to feel. The next region we're going to call the transitional region. And so that's where now this curve is no longer linear. We see it starts to be kind of a concave down polynomial, and until we get to this peak force here. And this is the peak amount of lateral force that our tires can generate, okay? You can see for whatever this random tire that they have in the book, it's about 1,700 pounds of lateral force. But note here that this is the peak amount, and from here on, we begin to actually lose force. And what's going to happen here is when we get to this point, when we exceed that peak amount of lateral force, we're basically going to lose control of the vehicle. That's where that's called like the frictional limit of the tires. And when we start losing lateral force, like you can imagine you're trying to go some turn, you need more and more force to hold that speed. Now all of a sudden you've lost force. You're going to travel at a radius that you did not intend to travel on. Your wheels are going to start slipping and you're going to kind of lose control of the car. In some cases you can like recover from this, but you want to be really careful of this like peak amount of force. And so really what's going to happen is the driver can kind of begin to feel when they're in this transitional region. They can feel when they're beginning to lose force, the more like, because in this region, in the linear region, the more they turn the wheel, they can just sort of feel that they're getting more lateral force, and they can take that turn faster or tighter. But then when we get into this region, they're going to be demanding more and more lateral force and just not getting it as fast as they need it. And that's going to be very obvious for the driver to feel, and they're really never going to want to exceed this. And a really interesting thing is that I don't know if you've ever heard of like traction control in like your passenger cars. Any passenger car you drive is going to basically automatically have traction control enabled. And what traction control does is your passenger car has this exact model in it. It has like in your car's computer, it has a model of this for your tires. And what it's going to do is it's going to limit the amount of like force that you can actually request from your car from either steering or from acceleration. And they're going to try and keep you in this like linear range, because most drivers, most like just passenger car drivers, are not good enough to actually like operate the vehicle safely in this transitional region. So that your car will limit what you can do to keep you in this linear region where it's much easier to control the car. And that's actually the same way that ABS works, but I'll get to that when we talk about slip ratio.
Do professional drivers want to operate in the transitional region, like since they know how to control it?
Yes.
Okay.
Ideally, they're right at that peak.
Yeah,
Because
they are like
the fastest you
they
can
are
possibly
right there.
There's also like a very fine line between 4 and 5 degrees.
Yeah. One of what happens when you're in that transitional region, it's often described as like the steering will get light, because like what'll happen is if you're up at 5 degrees of slip angle, you're going to be applying, okay, your lateral force is 1600, and let's say there's a ratio of like 100 times by the time it gets to your hands. So you're going to be applying like 16 pounds. And in the linear region, if you're applying 4 pounds and you move it this much, you're going to be applying a whole extra pound. But at 16 pounds, you're going to move it this much and you're going to apply 16.1 pounds. So it's going to be, you're going to be turning really hard, but it's going to be really easy to move it.
That's also due to a different effect. That's also the pneumatic trail and mechanical trail, but that's a little more complicated, which we'll get into that at some point, but not for today. But yeah, Kyle's right. Like, drivers can feel this through the steering wheel. They can feel it as they accelerate, as they like take that corner. And that's like, I mean, that's what it takes to be a professional driver. Is like, you have to be so in tune with your car that you can sense those things and understand, like, know what it feels like to take your vehicle to the limit. Okay, cool. So this is what the lateral force plot for I-tires looks like. You can see we can get to much higher slip angles than they have in the example for RCBD without getting to that frictional limit. So you can kind of see our linear region from about 0 to 3 degrees. And from this point on, it kind of tapers off and becomes a little more transitional. But you can see, so these are actually, this is a plot of 4 different tires. So this is when we were looking at which tires to select. And it's interesting because you can see this purple tire generates far more lateral force. So this you'd say like this one allows to kind of go around the track faster, but the other tires are linear for much longer. So they'd be much easier for a driver to control, or an inexperienced driver to control at least. So these are the sorts of things when we're making tire decisions at the beginning of the year that we're looking at. We're trying to balance a factor of like, okay, how much lateral force can we get out of these that can make us turn faster and tighter, but these other ones might be easier to control. So like, how are we going to balance those factors? So then why, you might ask, you know, we'd have this maximum amount of slip angle that's like safe to drive at. You know, you might be asking, why are we just rocking at that max slip angle the whole time? Like every turn, every case, all the time. Why aren't we exactly at that limit? And the answer is basically we need to apply some longitudinal force too. Because even though, you know, as much as it'd be nice just to travel at constant speed and like only take corners, we have to brake and we have to accelerate. And so that's how we get into longitudinal forces of the tire. And like slip angle generates lateral force, slip ratio is what we're going to call generates longitudinal force. Slip ratio is kind of a weird concept to think about, but the definition of it is it's the ratio between the angular velocity that your like wheel or like driven part of the car is spinning at over the angular velocity of your tire. And what that's saying is the exact like sort of physical generation of this is that, you know, your tire can deform, right? And so say you have this coupled system. I don't know how to hold up my hands to make this obvious, but you have your wheel on the inside and your tire on the outside. And as you are driving your wheel to turn via either like the transmission, like cranking the half shafts, turning your wheel, because the tire can deform, you can crank this wheel a little bit at a slightly faster angular velocity than your tire would be going at. And those differences in angular velocity are going to cause deformation in your tire. And as we know with lateral force, when you cause like lateral deformation, that causes lateral force. If you're causing that longitudinal stretching or compression due to different angular velocities of your wheel versus tire, that's going to generate longitudinal force. I think I said a lot of words there and a lot of terms. Do you want to draw some stuff out or talk about that concept a little bit more? Any questions, or does that kind of make some sense?
I'm trying to think of a good way to think about slip ratio. The only thing that comes to mind is like if you take a t-shirt and you like spin it, like the inside of your t-shirt is going to deform and the outside won't. And that's because there's a certain amount of like stretch here. And that's what's happening to the tire. So the inside and the outside are moving relative to each other because the tire is like a big spring. Like you can spin, like there's a piece of rubber and you're taking the middle and you're trying to spin it. And the whole thing is going to want to kind of wind up before it starts to move. Or if it's already moving and you apply force to the outside, it's going to kind of wind itself before they catch up to each other.
Yeah. And then again, the phenomenon of actual, like Kyle said with the lateral forces, the phenomenon of actually creating the longitudinal force is due to the fact that the tire is rolling on the ground. So there's a section of the tire that is adhered to the ground at the bottom, and that can't stretch as much as the rest of the tire can. So when you're in the braking case, you don't want to talk about braking or acceleration? What even do I have here? Okay. Yeah, so in the acceleration case, which is what we have, I have the braking case here, I believe. But maybe acceleration is easy to think about. Let's think about acceleration. Okay. You're driving your wheel on the inside, and then your tire is kind of lagging to catch up on the outside, but the bottom is fixed. So now what's happening is your tire is trying to be twisted into the ground, and so it's compressing. It's compressing as it enters the beginning of like the contact with the ground, and that's going to cause that buildup. That's going to cause, as Kyle said, these tires are springs, and so you're compressing that spring. And then as that spring gets released, it's providing longitudinal force due to that like part being stuck on the ground and tire being constantly compressed into that and stretched out of that. It's a wacky thing to think about.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So like the part that's in contact with the ground, when you like as the velocity of the like entire car speeds up, or like the wheels or whatever, does the amount of tire that's in contact with the ground decrease, or is that constant regardless if it's velocity the car is going?
That's a good question. The size, so that's called, this section that's in contact with your ground is called your contact patch. And the size of your contact patch depends on how much weight is on the tire and how much air pressure the tires have. So it will change throughout the race because the amount of force on your tire, the amount of weight on your tires will change. And I'm going to get to that in a couple of slides, but I'm not sure. It's not necessarily a speed dependent thing. It's more of a weight dependent thing, but it will change. It will definitely change. And the size of your contact patch does change how much force your tires can generate. So it has some impact.
So the abstraction of this system is that you have your hub, and then you have a torsional spring that's attached to your hub and fixed to the ground. Except, so like in a static case, you've got a torsional spring between your hub and your ground, and when you like put force into the hub, the spring is going to load up and it's going to put force in the ground.
Yeah.
And then the reason we use slip ratio is because this whole system is rotating. So
Exactly.
the point of the top, like the basically your torsional spring is constantly rotating, but it's always fixed to the ground at some point. The point's just rotating. So the slip ratio is kind of like the rotational displacement of your torsional spring, but in a rotating system.
Yeah, exactly.
The slip ratio describes how compressed your tire is in which direction.
In a rotating frame, yeah.
In a rotating frame.
And you can think of the section that's fixed to the ground, as you said, it's constantly changing. But if you were to take a snapshot of the system, you would see a fixed point, and you'd see an amount of compression in that tire, aka torsional spring, and that is being reacted by the friction force at the point that's on the ground. And that is what the longitudinal force is, fundamentally. But it's also, the important thing is, it's a little more complicated than that too, because your tire is also getting stretched throughout the contact patch. But I think it's a great abstraction to think about. You have this hub and you have a torsional spring, which I think that might be a little bit complicated still for if you haven't taken mexology or anything like that, or worked with springs that much. But I think honestly, I'm glad we talked about this because it definitely will help build your intuition and mechanical models a little bit. But the important thing to take away from this is that when you are driving your wheel, either by cranking it in an acceleration case or cranking it the other direction in a braking case, you're going to cause some deformation in your tire along its circumferential axis, and that is going to cause some forward or some backward force. And that amount of compression is your slip ratio. Okay. So
and slip ratios are instantaneous, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So just like there's a lateral force versus slip angle plot, there is a longitudinal force versus slip ratio plot. And so on the left, here's the ones they have in RCVD. These are the same plot, but they obviously have a much longer x-axis in the book. So the one on the left is from RCVD, the one on the right is for our tires. You can see, it's pretty similar, there is a linear region and then very quickly sort of tapers off into a maximum tractive force that we can generate. Yeah, I don't have too much more to say about this. Any questions about these graphs?
What's the physical reason for it to taper off that because for slip angle, the reason it tapers off is because the way your contact patch goes, the center of force moves forward, and you end up you go from a scheme of mostly sticking and a little bit of slipping to mostly slipping. There's a kind of a transition there. Do you get a similar transition here?
I don't know what the physical description of the transition would be, except that it's probably a similar thing. At some point your wheels just start slipping. Your tires start spinning. You sort of break the best I can give you is you break the frictional limit of the tires, because your tires still have an amount of sort of static friction that they can apply as they're rolling, and that can be overcome.
It looks like that's around 1.
Well, yeah. So the 1 is just your normalized traction force. So for us,
no. On the left diagram, it's the traction slip rate, the slip ratio of 1. It says onset of spinning.
Right. Which is, I think, is interesting that it sort of has that taper off. I don't know why it goes down. It must be a similar thing. Now you're changing some amount of how much your tire is actually compressing or stretching versus how much it's just slipping.
Okay.
What's the definition of? Oh, sorry. Continue.
So it sounds like you get to some maximum, and then you reach a physical limit of the rubber for its ability to be twisted and stretched.
Yeah, exactly.
You're going to get a reduction in force as you increase the difference, and then at some point it's just going to start slipping. Yeah. And when it slips, you're going to be at a basically constant force, reducing slightly. Okay, cool.
What's the definition of spinning? Is that just when like the tires keep rotating and they're not actually like in contact with the ground?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think it means you have the instantaneous tangential force at or tangential like velocity of your tires is different than the velocity that your wheel is traveling along the road.
Okay.
Slip ratio, is that, can you go back a slide real quick?
Yeah.
Wheel over tire. Okay. So at a slip ratio of 1, the angular velocity of your wheel is twice that of the angular velocity of your tire.
Yeah. Which is a very weird thing. I mean, a majority of your like slip ratio action is going to happen in that like 0 to 0.15 slip ratio range. Like that's where like a majority of your launching the force is going to be applied.
Yeah. So
The SAE definition is just kind of arbitrary.
I don't know where it comes from. I mean,
Okay.
I'm sure we could find it. They might talk about an RCBD. It's honestly not something I've spent too much time thinking about.
So it seems like slip ratio is something that's super instantaneous, because there's no way you could maintain a slip ratio of 1 for any, or even 0.5 for any significant length of time.
Yeah, that'd be insane. Like imagine your wheel spinning twice as fast as your tires. Like,
You'd wrap your tire around your wheel.
Yeah,
if it was
exactly.
for any length of time.
Exactly.
So could you think of these like, so under any kind of transient system, like you start braking and you're going to apply your braking force.
Mm-hmm.
So like you start braking, you're going to reach a slip ratio pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And but it can't stay at that slip ratio, because any positive or negative, like any slip ratio is going to cause them, any slip ratio maintained for any significant length of time, like your wheel is going to start, or your tire is going to start wrapping around your wheel like quite significantly. So in any transient case, you're going to like press the brakes. I'm trying to think of like slip ratio over time. Are you going to get some like peak and then back down to 0?
Isn't it different in the braking case? Because your wheels can lock, and therefore, like, as long as that first fraction has a 0 in the numerator, you can like retain like a constant slip ratio of like -1 for at least a little bit of time.
Yeah, but I guess in either case it can slip. I'm just trying to understand of like what it looks like over time, and like I'm just trying to attach like the physical of what's happening to the wheel to the numbers.
Yeah. Would it be correct to say that like over time the braking cases and the acceleration cases are different? Like over how long?
I mean, they're definitely different.
Okay.
You can maintain a slip ratio. I mean, if you brake for any time you apply a force with your tires, there's going to be a slip ratio. If you're not braking for a constant amount of time, you're going to maintain that slip ratio throughout the entire length of time you're applying it. And there's no limit to how long you can apply it for. Because the wheel is rotating. It's not the same. I was kind of getting confused on why the tire is going to wrap around itself, Kyle.
So slip ratio is the ratio. It's the angular velocity of the wheel divided by the angular velocity of the tire. So if, let's say you have a slip ratio, let's say you're maintaining a slip ratio of 0.1, and then it's that -1. So if we add 1 to that, that means the ratio of your wheel divided by your tire is 1.1. So your wheel moves 10% faster than your tire. But if that's for any length of time, like if your wheel is moving if your tire is moving at 1 and your wheel is moving at 1.1, move for 1 second. That means that your wheel has moved 10% farther than your tire, right? But if you move for 2
I don't think that's the right definition.
That is what it is in RCBA.
Maybe I'm misunderstanding.
But hold on, will you read yourself?
Yeah.
Okay. If you read the next part in RCBD, I mean, it basically does say what you were saying a bit earlier, Kyle. So prior to the peak, an increase in slip angle gives an increased force, which tends to damp the rotational velocity. Once a tire exceeds the slip ratio for peak force and needs traction or braking, it becomes unstable and the wheel tends to either spin up, which is like when you're accelerating, your wheel will slip a little bit and spin, or lock. And so I think it is sort of like a sort of control mechanism where as it begins to slip or like lock up, even just like a little bit, it'll sort of bring you back to that peak lateral force or peak longitudinal force.
I think what I'm missing here is that whenever you have a slip ratio, you are actively changing the angular velocities of your wheel. I think that's what I'm missing. Because what's happening is when you apply the brake, you're changing the angular velocity of your wheel. However, when you do that, because you're loading up the system, you're gonna there's gonna be a force on the ground, and what's gonna happen is you're then gonna change the angular velocity of your tire. Like if we think of this as like impulses, like you snap brakes for a second, your wheel is gonna slow down, and you're gonna have a slip ratio, and but then your tire is gonna slow down until they catch up again.
Yeah.
And then so you're gonna okay. I think you can. The reason you can it sounds like the reason you can maintain a slip ratio is because when you instigate a slip ratio by either accelerating or braking, your tire is also going to change velocity when you're changing your wheel velocity.
Yeah, that is true. It is also important to note that there are multiple definitions of slip ratio, but it's oftentimes used. The multiple definitions are basically to make it easier to define based on like what you're using to test the slip ratio. So a lot of them actually have some amount of because they're oftentimes testing on a rolling surface instead of like a rolling tire. So, but
I don't know if you could point me in the right direction, or if you have any resources. I'd love to see a graph, like a transient, like a graph of either slip ratio over time or like wheel and tire velocities over time.
Yeah, for sure.
Not now, but I think that would really help me.
I agree. I think that would really help clarify at this point. But I think what you're saying before is right. I think it's kind of constantly walking back and forth between the slip ratio of 0 and over a little bit over 1 as a function of time. So yeah, slip ratio, confusing. But let's keep going because it's definitely good that we all sort of understand this stuff physically and intuitively, because I think it just helps you be able to visualize what's happening as you learn more about some more stuff. But I want to get to sort of some important points, which is that kind of tying back to why don't we operate at the maximum slip angle all the time? And that is because there is a maximum total amount of force a tire can generate. And that total amount of force can kind of get split up between longitudinal and lateral. And you can imagine that's due to just how much a tire can stretch and deform before it loses traction with the road surface. And so you can imagine that if our tire at its current weight can produce 1,000 pounds of force total in any direction, then we might have a plot that looks like this, which is where on the y-axis we have our tractive forces, and on our x-axis we have our lateral forces. And so we would have basically any amount of breakdown between these two, between all different forces, would exist on a circle with a radius of 1,000 pounds of force. And this is what we call a friction ellipse. In this case, it's a friction circle. There are cases where this is not exactly a circle. It can be slightly more elliptical, where you can sometimes produce more lateral force, you can produce tractive force, depending on the way that the tire is made. Because another thing to note is that there are different types of tires. Those can produce forces in different ways. But for simplification, let's imagine we have a friction circle. And so you can imagine if we're going down a straightaway, we would want all of our force to be in the longitudinal direction because we're not turning at all. And so we'd want to be on this sort of y-intercept of the friction circle, where we're providing 1,000 pounds of force directly in the longitudinal direction. But say in this other case, we want to be going as fast as possible. And as I sort of discussed in the other presentation I gave, going as fast as possible means always accelerating as much as you can. So in this case, we'd want to split up our amount of force, the total amount of force we can apply, into some amount of longitudinal force and some amount of lateral force to make this sort of like wider corner. And so we can find ourselves on this frictional ellipse and see that in this case, even though our prior tires are providing 1,000 pounds of force total, they'd be providing 700 pounds in longitudinal, 700 pounds in lateral. Does that make sense? And so you might notice that the frictional ellipse looks very similar to our GG diagram. And these two things are, assuming we're in a tire limited vehicle, these two things are effectively the same plot. Just the GG diagram is the frictional ellipse divided by mass. And if you remember from the other plot, the reason that this upper section is a different radius is because we are a rear-wheel drive car, so we only get the benefit of 2 tires worth of force in the forward longitudinal direction. But you can see that these two plots are telling us a very similar story. So if we want to increase that GG diagram, which we determine is what makes us go around the track faster, we want to increase this frictional ellipse and always be on the right side of it. Does that make sense?
From a testing perspective, is it easier to generate a GG diagram than it is to generate a frictional ellipse?
Substantially.
Okay.
To make a GG diagram, all you need is an accelerometer.
Okay.
To make, it's honestly very difficult to measure the amount of force at your tires. So it's always finding a measure we can take to plug into a model we're most confident in. So in theory, we could take our GG diagram, take that accelerometer data, and if we knew the mass of our car, we could get a sense for how much total amount of force our tires were applying. But then that's very difficult to understand how much force each tire is applying. What we can do instead is we can look at the forces in our control arms, which is why we actually put strain gauges, or for this year, we're going to put strain gauges on our suspension members, because having an understanding of how much force is going through those suspension members will determine how much force is being applied at the tire. But again, we have a mathematical model of basically doing like a statics equation of understanding if we have some force down at the tire contact patch and we're measuring our forces at these different like axes and positions, we can do the math that gets us there, but it's still assuming sort of like a static case. And there's there's a little bit of lack of precision in understanding exactly where our suspension was in its travel, because that changes the angles that those forces are seen at. So the GG diagram is easier to make. Both are useful. That's a good question. Cool. So this kind of takes me to the last section, which is what limits the boundaries of that frictional ellipse. And it's kind of comes down to, there are more factors in this, like tire temperature is a big one, but the two that I'm going to talk about today that are really important is the tires that you use and the amount of normal force that is on those tires. And this is sort of Rohill where we're going to get into some why aerodynamics is important. So the tires you use, as we were looking before, we were looking at how much like force those tires could generate through various slip ratios and slip angles. So that directly will determine how fast you can go. If we put like the Formula 1 tires on our car, like we'd probably go pretty fast. They're pretty sticky. And if we put like really crappy road tires on our car, we would not go nearly as fast. And now the other thing is normal force. So there's a quick recap of what normal force means. If you have some weight W on your tire and your tire is resting on the ground will react that weight with a normal force. So you can just imagine it's how much force is going into like kind of squeezing your tire onto the ground. So another question we have is, why would the normal force on your tires change? And so the answer is something that we call weight transfer. So I'll do a little bit of math here, but it's very abstract. And so hopefully it's like kind of straightforward to understand. So imagine this is our car just resting. I know it doesn't quite look like a car, but here are 2 tires. And here is our, just a representation of like the center of mass of our chassis. Here, I actually missed a little thing here. And then we have, this has some weight W. Okay, so right now our car is just chilling, nothing's happening to it. We have some weight W, and our two normal forces are reacting that weight, and we can assume right now that these are equal, and so the normal force on each tire are the same, and so our car is not rotating at all. And so there's just like a quick equation here, the amount of the sort of torque, and I'm going to sum torque about this little black point here, is the normal force of tire 1 times its radius, plus the normal force of the second tire times its negative radius, and that's going to sum to 0. So we can see that our car is not rotating. So now in a turning case, where we have some applied force at our chassis center of mass, we know that when we turn our car doesn't just like turn in a big circle. It doesn't just like roll around as you turn. So we know that the sum of all the torques is going to be 0. But we can see that the way this happens is when we have this applied force, this normal force on this right tire is going to need to increase to fight the torque being caused by this applied force times this radius here. And so what this means is as we're turning, now the distribution of normal forces between our tires is going to change. And the tire on the right, in this case, is going to have an increased amount of normal force. The tire on the left is going to have a decreased amount of normal force. And this is a phenomenon we call weight transfer. And weight transfer is an extremely important thing when we talk about suspension and vehicle dynamics. So let's pause here and sort of talk about this a little bit. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah. Yvonne is asking if she should join right now, or should she just do it at a different time with you?
She can join, and then I'm also happy to set up a different time with her.
Okay.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions about this like kind of simplified diagram of what is causing weight transfer? I know it's like kind of crappily thrown together equations, but the gist to take away here is when you have some lateral force on your car, then it's going to change the distribution of weight amongst your tires. And what's going to happen is that if you turn right, your weight is going to transfer to the outside, so it's going to transfer to the left, and so your left tires will see more normal force. And I know that's a little bit confusing the way I've drawn this here because I have this applied force to the right, and the reaction force on the right tires is increasing. But what's actually happening is that you can think of the force on your chassis as being sort of an inertial force, which means it's like a reaction force coming from, so if you're turning to the right, it is kind of that centrifugal force we were talking about. And so your chassis is going to be sort of pushed out to the left if you're turning right, or your center of mass is going to be pushed out to the left. And that's going to cause weight transfer on your outer tires. So yeah, like I said, I think I made this diagram a little bit confusing, but for now, just as long as you understand that if you're turning and you have some lateral force in your car, then you're going to put more weight on your outside tires. And so
yeah,
I'm
kind of confused by that.
Yeah, I made that confusing. Let me think of the best way to describe this. Okay. If you're turning...
Is it just that, like, if you're turning right, like, the chassis is, like, being pushed the other way, so the outside wheel has to, like, accommodate for that, so it has to exert a larger force to turn?
Yeah. The sequence of events that kind of happens is like when you turn, this is my understanding, please correct me if I'm wrong.
No,
but when you turn, you create a slip angle on the front tires. And when you create that slip angle, you then get a force, like, okay, we're turning to the right. You turn your tires to the right, you create a slip angle. From that slip angle, you get a lateral force, and the lateral force pushes you to the right. But when you move the bottom, so the wheels are below the center mass. So like if you take like any hanging object and you move the bottom, the top is going to want to go the other way. So like if I move the bottom this way, the top of my water bottle wants to fall that way. And that's the inertial force. So you generate a slip angle, you generate a lateral force, and the tires are going to move to the right. And the whole chassis is, because of momentum, is going to want to keep going in the same direction. So you're kind of sweeping the legs out from underneath the chassis. And so the chassis is going to move that way with a force that we can calculate from the simplification is centripetal force. So we can calculate the inertial force that the chassis feels moving it to the left. And then from that, we can calculate, okay, there's a centripetal force that's moving, or there's a inertial force that's moving the chassis over to the left and it's rolling it. And then from that roll, we can calculate the normal force distribution on the tires.
Yeah.
And then that's going to load the tire more. And what we see is that based on the loading of the tire and the slip angle, the amount of lateral force generated is going to change. So in some cars, what you can feel is when you turn the wheel, and if you do it quickly, the car is going to roll very fast. But what you're going to feel is that you're going to turn, and then as the car rolls, you're going to turn more. You're going to kind of feel the car roll into the turn. And the reason is because when you change the loading on the tires, you're going to change the amount of force you get out of them for a given slip angle.
Yeah, that's true, except that if you're maintaining a constant slip angle in that case and you roll more, you'll actually turn less once you've completely transferred your weight.
Yeah.
Which I'll get to in a second. That's sort of the next point. But I think the only thing that's the like inertial force that you feel on your chassis is not caused by the torque between it's not caused by the moment between the lateral force on your tires and the radius between that and your center of mass. I think that's not what actually the inertial force is, but I don't really know how to give like a good description of why the inertial force is the other way, except that like imagine when you accelerate forward in your car, you're sort of thrown backwards into your seat, right? Like when you experience some force applied to your body, you sort of feel the inverse force from that.
Yeah.
But I'm not really giving a good description of why that's the case. So I think it's just easiest to think about. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how to describe this, which is like a failure of my understanding. So I can look more into it and try and find like a more clear description of what's causing that. But
okay.
For now, like, yeah, if the applied force is going to the right, your chassis feels an inertial force that's throwing you out of the turn. And that's causing
cool
weight transfer. So then why does all this matter? So, So I'm sure you all are aware of this frictional force equation where the force of friction is equal to the normal force times some coefficient of friction, right? And so what this creates, if we sort of plot this as a function of friction force and normal force, as we increase the normal force, the amount of friction force we apply will increase linearly, and the slope of that line is equal to our coefficient of friction. Do people see how I went from this equation to this graphical description of that? So in a perfect world, our tires would do the same thing. As we increase the weight on the tires and we increase the normal force that the tires are experiencing, the amount of frictional force would increase linearly. And if that were the case, we could basically turn as hard as we could, and no matter how much our weight changed, we would turn with the same amount of total lateral force. But this is actually not true for tires, sadly. Here's a little sad tire, sadly not linear. What it actually looks like is something more like this, where as we increase our normal force, our friction force will increase, but at a decreasing rate. So it's some sort of concave down polynomial, where as we're increasing this normal force, we are gaining more friction force, but again, like I said, at a decreasing rate. And so ultimately what this means for us is as our weight is transferring, the amount of force that our outside tires can produce is increasing. And the amount of force that our inside tires can produce is decreasing. But the amount the outside tires are gaining is getting bigger at a lower rate. So the total amount of force that our tires can generate as weight is being transferred actually goes down. So you can apply more force total before weight has been transferred. So in general, we want to minimize weight transfer as much as possible. Does that phenomenon kind of make sense? I don't think I explained that very well, but I can try again. Ro and Diana, does that concept kind of make sense?
Yeah.
If you could repeat a little bit, that might be helpful for me.
Yeah, I was going to make like a graphic to sort of like walk through the step by step. So maybe I'll do that and tie into next week's presentation. But so before we've started the turn and all of our weight is distributed equally on our tires, each tire has the same amount of normal force on it. And
Yep.
so here, I can annotate this on the graph. So say before we enter the turn, we're here on the plot. Oh, geez. So we're here. All 4 tires. Now, as we take the turn, I'll do this in a different color. Now we're in blue. As we take the turn, our outside tires have more normal force on them. So our outside tires are now somewhere up here. And our inside tires are somewhere here.
Okay.
So we've gained force linearly in this section, but we've lost force quadratically on the outside. And so that means the sum total of the amount of force. So if we sum up the force from all 4 tires, so the car, as we sum those,
It's gone down.
yeah, it equals, wait, this is less than this case.
Okay. Why is the line itself like curved? Is that tire composition?
I don't know physically why that's the case.
Okay.
It's going to be a combination of like
Which
compressing the sidewalls, but also like when you compress your sidewalls, it's going to want to like push them under the tire, and you're going to get like the actual surface is going to bend up, or like there's a lot of things moving all at once. But it also like along the length of the tire, it's going to squish more. Like just think of like when you like if you have like a flat tire and you like push on it, or if you push on it with your hand, it creates this weird surface.
Yeah, well, I think the important thing is that like more surface gives you more force, but then there are some losses in that, I guess.
Okay.
And those losses, yeah, maybe they come from sidewall versus like center of the contact patch of the tire is like a whole different thing, is sort of the anatomy of the tire. But I think, yeah, the important takeaway is just understanding this kind of general behavior. And if you're interested in the specifics, I can try to find some resources that might explain that. Like I said, I mean, tires are kind of magic, and I don't understand physically what's happening in them a lot of the time. But
yeah, that's fine.
the phenomenon here is like what drives a lot of design. So I think it's okay to take this one at face value for now, and then we can do some more digging.
Sounds good.
Cool. So now I'm going to put on 2 different graphs, and these are capturing the same phenomenon, but just in a slightly different way. So what we have here is a lateral force versus slip angle plot again, and we can see what this looks like for the different normal forces or different loads on the tires. So there's 3 different lines plotted here, each one for a different amount of normal force. And so the important thing here to sort of look at to kind of like see the same phenomenon happening is that when we're at, when we're at like a slip angle of 5 for this 900-pound tire, we're looking at like approximately looking at approximately 900 pounds of force, I would say. And then when we double the load and we're at a slip angle of 5 at this 1800 line, we have not doubled the total amount of lateral force that we can apply. We're looking at maybe closer to 1700. So we have not, in fact, we've increased, but we have not increased linearly. And so this is a really useful plot, and this is what's called lateral force coefficient. And what that's going to do is it's going to divide the total amount of lateral force you can apply by the amount of normal force on the tire. And so now what we see is that as we increase slip angle, we can see that this like normalized amount of lateral force versus normal force is lower for our 1800-pound case as opposed to our 900-pound case. Do people see that in those 2 plots?
Yeah.
Cool. So this is kind of like a fundamental thing that we're fighting against is, in general, it's beneficial to have more normal force on the tires. Sorry, and this is the next one. So here's some takeaways. So more normal force on the tires means more available force. So this is why we want downforce, because downforce does move us up in the total amount of force that we can apply. So that's great. Even though it happens at a decreasing rate, it doesn't matter because the total amount of force that we can ever apply has increased. However, when things like weight transfer occur, where there are gains and losses, and the losses are at a higher rate than the gains, that's a really bad thing, because now this means the total amount of lateral force we can apply in turns has gone down, which means that as we go all the way back to what that means for, like, we're going in a centripetal circle, if that force goes down, that means our speed goes down or our radius goes up. And those are both bad things in our case. So there are ways to combat weight transfer. There's one way to combat weight transfer. There's two ways to combat weight transfer. Weight transfer is a function of where your center of mass is placed and a function of how far apart your wheels are. And in general, the farther apart your wheels are, and that's what's known as your track width, the less weight transfer you're going to have, because you have a much wider radius. And so in that, like, math we were doing before, you only need to change the normal force that your tires change a little bit to account for the torque on your center of mass. Alternatively, if you move your center of mass down, that'll reduce the amount of weight transfer you see, because now you're fighting against a smaller moment. So you kind of imagine like your tire is a lever, and that's fighting a different lever, which is your center of mass. And if this lever is super long, then this needs less force to fight that. Or if this lever is much shorter, then you need less force to fight it. And so that's why track width and center of mass placement are very critical for racing. And that is everything that I've got. So thank you all for sticking along with it. I know that was a lot of content, but it was a lot of good discussion. So any questions before we wrap up?
I just want to say that I think the whole thing about the outside wheels like digging in more to the ground, it just helped. I checked out a video of like cars rolling over, and I think that helps like with the visualization. Cool.
Yeah, it's a good thing. It's something like I have like a really intuitive feel for, but yeah, I just cannot really capture that into a mathematical description very well. So I apologize for not being more prepared on that.
No, you're fine.
I'm glad you found something that was helpful.
If there's no more questions, I have some clarification on slip ratio. I was just reading through our CVD.
Awesome.
My misunderstanding came from an assumption that the tire is always stuck to the road until it hits the like sliding condition. Like my assumption was that there's like two regimes and they're like a very hard transition. But the other kind of way it frames the definition of slip ratio here is that it's the ratio of angular velocity times the radius. So like instantaneous tangential velocity of the wheel divided by the linear velocity of the like axle or of the car.
Yeah.
So if you have a slip ratio and then -1. So if you have a slip ratio of 0, that means that the tangential velocity of your wheel is equal to the velocity of your car. But any slip ratio that's not 0 means that your wheel is going to be sliding relative to the ground somewhat. And it's not sliding over the entirety of the contact patch, but it will be sliding over part of the contact patch. And it gives a little graph of wheel velocity. And so like when you're accelerating the front of your, when you're accelerating the front of your contact patch is going to be faster than the road. And the rear of your contact patch is going to be slower than the road. And there's going to be a net sliding effect, but there's going to be points of your tire that are sticking and points that are not, and points that are moving in different directions. So so like if your slip ratio equals 1 or -1, so if it equals -1, that means that your tangential velocity divided by your linear velocity is 0. So that means that your tangential velocity is 0. I guess this is a braking case.
Yeah.
And what that means is that your wheel is literally not moving, but your car is. So that's where you're like just sliding along the road. And then anything between 0 and -1 in the braking case means that your tangential velocity is lower than your outside velocity, but they're still rolling. So that was my confusion came from the fact that I assume the tire is always stuck to the road until it's not.
Gotcha.
But the tire is, unless you're not accelerating longitudinally, the tire is always slipping a little bit relative to the road, but it's not like the entire contact patch is not sliding. Different parts are sliding relative to each other.
Gotcha. That's a great clarification. Thanks for digging that up.
Yeah. And that sliding is because in the front of the contact patch, like if you're braking the front of the contact patch, you're compressing your rubber. And in the rear of the contact patch, your rubber decompresses.
So it has to slide some amount to get that.
Yeah. And that's why it's important that your tire, you can, like, that's where the rubber comes in, and the fact that it's a spring, because you're kind of compressing it and releasing it, and you end up with a net force due to that.
Wait, that's the braking case? I thought it stretches in the front in the braking case.
So in the braking case?
Yeah, I think it stretches in the front of the braking case.
Sorry. Yes. In the braking case, it stretches in the front and it compresses in the rear.
I could be wrong. Let me just check.
I think diagrams. I got it mixed up, but.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Anil says you're right, Rojo.
Okay.
Sweet. That's super helpful. Thanks for looking at that graph. That definitely helped my understanding. That's dope. So yeah, you can see. Oh, do you want to talk?
One thing I want to add for Rohill is that it's important to remember that by adding aerodynamics, or by adding aero to the car, you not only increase your variable downforce, but you also increase the amount of drag on the vehicle. So that's why judges might say bad aero is worse than no aero. Because bad aero will add to your downforce, but it'll add to drag more. So the amount you gain in traction is not as much as you lose in drag. And that's where the balance, that's where finding that balance is really important. Then the other thing is you have aero kind of around the car. You have the rear wing, the under tray, the front wing. And each of those will add force to your car unevenly between the tires. So that's another consideration when you start designing it. And then another interesting thing from like a brakes perspective is you will slow down faster if you operate at the best slip ratio than if you're locked up and skidding, because the plot peaks and then it drops. So you're skidding and your slip ratio is -1. You're past the peak. But if you're braking as optimal as possible, you're slowing down as fast as you can, you're going to be right at the peak of that graph. So that's why if you're designing a brake system, you need to analyze the brakes test, which is just locking the wheels and sliding to a stop. You also need to analyze how you can maximize deceleration, which is at that peak. And that's what your car is doing with an anti-lock braking system. Is it's measuring the linear speed of the vehicle with maybe GPS or something, and it's also measuring the wheel speed with a wheel speed sensor, and it's optimizing that ratio to brake just as much as possible without locking up the wheels.
Yeah, and then I think from a vehicle control perspective, brakes a little bit less than that, because people are really bad at controlling the vehicle as it sort of in that transitional region. So ABS keeps people at the maximum of the linear region of your slip ratio plot, which is cool. Yeah, and there's something else I was going to say with what you said.
Well, one last cool thing is if you're braking on ice, you might feel the pedal pulse, and what that's doing is it's measuring your freewheeling speed and your braking speed. So like it's measuring the vehicle's linear speed without braking, and then the kind of braking speed. So it's comparing two things to get your slip ratio. But it's going like brake on, brake off, brake on, brake off, and it's constantly comparing the two values to see how your slip ratio is changing.
That's fucking sick.
Hydraulic PWM.
Yeah, the coolest for measuring. I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's really cool.
That's pretty sweet. One note on aero for you, Rohill. One thing I've also heard about aero is like some people make a wing that weighs 40 pounds.
Yeah.
But it only adds like 10 pounds of downforce.
Yeah.
you might as well just put 10 pounds of steel on the underside of your car. You've also added 40 pounds of weight. That's really high, and that's going to contribute to high safety.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Another thing about the Aero that's particularly interesting about FSAE, and obviously Rohit, you know more about this than I do, but like we're at a really weird racing speed to have Aero, because like F1 is super useful because the downforce is proportional to V squared. So is drag, but like I think actually, yeah. So it's like we're operating at crazy low speeds to justify Aero packages
Yeah.
compared to like F1. So it's not
Yep.
like interesting thing to note.
For sure. That's why we got to do a lot of testing.
Awesome. Well, that took a long time, so thank you all so much for powering through. I'll upload this recording somewhere so we can have it. And Yvonne, if you want to check that out, when you get a chance, if you want to sort of watch a portion you're here for, I think that'd be great. And then we can find a time later this week to tag up with any questions that you have. For next week, by the end of today, I'll send out what y'all should have read for next week. I think we're ready to launch into some steady state turning cases, which should be pretty interesting. This stuff is taking me a really long time to understand, so I'm gonna really try and slow down next week and like take our time with some of these concepts. But it's also really cool stuff, and it's stuff that we haven't really considered as a team. So I'm hyped for everybody to get some eyes on it. Sweet.
Cool.
Thanks everybody.
Putting this
Thank
together,
you.
mate.
That was really good.
What time are meetings from now on?
We are meeting normally Thursdays from 6 to 7 Eastern. For you guys, 3 to 4 Pacific.
Okay.
If that consistently doesn't work, which it should based on the when to meet, we should make sure the when to meet is filled out properly, and we'll go back to that. But
Yeah, it's fine. I just mixed it up last time.
it's all good. All right.
Cool. All
All
right.
right. Take care, everybody.